Hey everyone, Attorney Nathan Sweet here. Welcome back to the Catholic American. I just want to help you keep the rosary in one hand and the Constitution in the other. Boom, you'll be golden. You'll be golden. You'll live such a great life. And you also help make our country so much better if you do that. You ever scroll through Twitter and see people fighting and yelling and just think, what the heck happened to us? Well, this brings us to Federalist number 10. Okay, great read. Highly encourage you to read it. James Madison wrote this one, founding father, and he nails it. He calls it, man, 230 odd years ago. He talks in this about factions being inevitable. Factions, not fractions, but factions, different interests, different groups of people fighting. And he talks about, obviously, they can be dangerous. And if we don't fix that or figure out a way around it, we, especially back then and today, we could be done as a society. But here's the fun part. The Catholic workaround that we Catholics can bring to the table nowadays is the same that our founding father, James Madison, figured out. And let me tell you why. He actually had a lot of the same natural law principles that we have in our catechism. That's for a lot of good reasons that we'll explain later on the podcast. But Madison, at the time that he's writing this, he's dealing with chaos in America from the Articles of Confederation. There was a real question at the time whether America would make it or not, whether the states would continue to work together. And it was an absolute dumpster fire, the Articles of Confederation. Everything was voluntary between the states. There was really nothing binding. They were competing and fighting kind of like siblings, and there was lots of rivalries and factions between different states and different interests. And sometimes we forget that America has always kind of been a melting pot and had been a bunch of different interests. And we have this picture, I think, sometimes that America was homogeneous at the time of the founding, that they were all white men that were largely on the same page, living the same way. But that's definitely not the case. I mean, people took religion very serious back then. And, there's very little in common that a Puritan would have with a Quaker or an Anglican in the South. You think, again, we just don't take our religion as seriously nowadays. Because there were very big differences back then. And in early America, you had different economic systems. There were, plantation farmers in Virginia. There were cobblers in Boston. Virginia had, lots of the biggest southern state had large plantations and slaves running things and tobacco crops. And Massachusetts was completely different. There were lots of Puritans up there, and think of like the Scarlet Letter type lifestyle and fire and brimstone, and on Sundays. And, New York City, I guess, is the one thing that was maybe similar in the fact that it was nuts even at the time in a lot of ways. There was Dutch and English people mixed in with Jewish people and French traders. I picture them all like walking across the street, yelling like, I'm walking here, like in other languages at each other. And even little places like nowadays we don't think much about, little Rhode Island, and it was printing money like the feds do now. There was a lot of problems, and there was problems with state debt at the time coming out of the Revolution, and the states had a bunch of IOUs, stuff they owed, and even had different currencies. Debt collection, if they defaulted, was a problem. The basically national debt essentially from the war, who was going to pay what, was an issue. Comes up in the Federalist Papers, in the first 10 of them actually. So we also had threats from outside. I mean, Britain still owned forts all around us. The Spanish were to the west. Indians, were still raiding borders with no army to stop them. You gotta know Hamilton's probably freaking out at the time, like, we're gonna get eaten alive if we don't work together. And Madison's thinking at the time, we need a real government before these tribes, tear us apart and different factions tear us apart in the country. Um, but here's the twist. They had to balance, how do you have unity without concentrating too much power in one spot? Because they were so wise, both from their experience with King George in England, but also from history, going all the way back in recorded history, that they did not want tyranny. And if you put too much power in one spot, it's going to be tyranny city all day long. And so they had a lot of the American public was aware of this too, because we're coming out of the revolution. So how do you convince your fellow citizens that this new, stronger federal government was good for them without taking risk of tyranny from a federal government? And the solution was to write these papers. These Federalist Papers are like a good PR campaign back then, explaining the new Constitution, the ideas that are going to be embodied in them, and trying to get up public support. And now the Federalist Paper number 10 is huge. I mean, it's huge. It's a really good one. It's like James Madison's coming out party. He's hitting hard. It's like his 18th century version of like a mic drop. And he basically highlights that how do you deal with factions, and how do we build a government that's smart, that's not going to be tyrannical, but also can deal with factions. And according to him, how you stop all this different factions of rich versus poor, North versus South, different types of interest. We could think, the coming issues, Catholics versus Protestants, all that stuff, from blowing up. And spoiler alert, before you read it, hopefully you read it, you kind of outsmart the factions in how you build your government. The Federalist Papers came about, like I said, in 1787. And, this is, again, just such a diverse time. And I think trying to outsmart factions through putting together a series of checks and balances, which we'll get to as we go along here, is absolutely just genius. The founders, it's really important to note this. There were lots of factions back then that wanted to fight, and the founders did not flame the factions to hate each other and try to get them to fight and hate each other so their political party cronies could win the next election and spend, the other factions' tax dollars on their pork projects and their interests and what they want to do. The government wasn't set up that way. And later on, as soon as Jefferson versus Adams, there starts to be, some pretty nasty back and forth. But at least at this point in time, political parties had not reached their heyday for sure. And James Madison saw that, factions were everywhere, and they were just part of kind of maybe the nature of society, different interests. And hopefully they were hoping to unite them under one common constitutional principle, and build a government that would be safe from their infighting. And Madison basically says factions come from two things. And I think it's really interesting because they still come from two things. I mean, these people were so smart. They're prophetic. And he says, one, they come from money fights about money, spending, definitely. And they come from fights about ideas, like principles, moral issues, abortion, guns, gender, all that stuff nowadays that we argue over. I mean, it sounds like America today. We fight over money and we fight over ideas. So some things just don't change. And he drops this quote I think is really interesting. He says, the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. So yeah, humans are messy, flawed, power hungry, jealous, backbiting, manipulative, selfish, gossips, and that's our nature. And I think that he recognizes, and the founders recognize, that the politicians are not any better. And, he's not just describing his ex-girlfriend. He's describing everyone. And all of us Catholics, we we call this innate depravity in our theology. It doesn't mean that we're all evil and we're incapable of any good, but it means that we as human beings and us Catholics understand that man is fundamentally flawed. And he talks of this like with factions as solutions in Federalist 10. And he discusses the idea of pure democracy. And you may not be familiar with that, but pure democracy is the idea that just the majority vote goes. And that's pure democracy. So 51 out of 100, that's the rule. And he basically says this is a terrible idea for the reason that he points out of pure democracy. He says, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. It doesn't cure faction. And he knew that you had to have a check and balance on pure democracy, or some people call it, I would, mob rule, that just the pure majority gets to do whatever they want. Because tyranny can be voted in by the majority, just as it can come from the iron fist of a single person, a single ruler. So you should not be okay with either one. And this is why, thank God, in America, even if 51% voted to ban, our religion, our faith, Catholics voted to ban the Mass, like was done in England and other parts of the Protestant Reformation, it would be unconstitutional. Why? Because the founders, like James Madison and Federalist 10, wanted to create a republic with checks and balances. And eventually the Anti-Federalists thankfully got added in the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about. And, I will say the Bill of Rights acknowledges rights given by God. But they don't even anticipate naming all of them, by the way. And Justice Scalia points this out in a lot of his speeches. They're just the particular rights that our founding fathers saw tyrannical governments tending to violate. So if you see a government, your government nowadays, violating the Fourth Amendment, violating the First Amendment, religion, speech, okay, freedom of assembly, the Second Amendment, your gun rights, criminal justice rights that we have in the Fifth and Sixth, right? And the Eighth. If you see the government doing these things, that's a bad sign that they're acting in a tyrannical manner. So the founders set the system to fight against itself as well with checks and balances. And they put in a Bill of Rights that certain things that the government shouldn't violate and couldn't violate. And the idea was let ambition fight ambition. Through a Catholic lens, I think this is right on, because we're building in protections for these natural God-given rights that cannot be violated by a single authoritarian ruler or a giant mob voting to do so in the name of equality or socialism. And it was our great Catholic theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas, who said that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation in the divine law. Isn't that amazing? The natural law, so the idea that we have these rights and they're God-given, is us rational people's participation in God's law. And so I think that what James Madison did here in our founding fathers was really, really important in the history of man. It is essential. It is a critical point, I should say, in the history of mankind, that rights come from God and not from DC, or even the consent of your fellow citizens. If a majority of them thought you don't have them, well, so what? They're God-given. The majority doesn't rule on that. And that's why we have a great system set up with our courts, where the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals are supposed to be insulated from that a little bit by appointment, because they sit in judgment of whether those rights of the minority have been taken by the majority a lot of times. So the compromise of the Constitution was a brilliant way of setting in motion the rights of all people that would unfold in a very short period of time, like nowhere else in the world. I love President Kennedy's speech on the "We Must Go to the Moon" speech. He talks about if you break down all of human history in 50 years, and you made all of human history into 50 years time period, that we are moving at a breakneck speed. It was like a second ago we got electricity. It's crazy. And we're living in a modern time that has just accelerated. In America, our people have done that. And I think we forget this in modern times. as the government infringes on our natural rights through taxation of fruits of our own labor and giving it to another who doesn't earn it, or the actions of the police state in violating our rights against the police state, whether it's surveillance or criminal justice, and through indoctrination of our children in the educational systems, a lot of times, which teach in some states and some school jurisdictions pure propaganda for history. I mean, they realize if they could tell a fake story of history or focus history on some detail, a series of details to accomplish their ends, that they're going to indoctrinate your kids. And sometimes this stuff makes probably you feel like it does me, like we have more of a chokehold from the government, state, local, federal, than we do a check and balance. But James Madison says that evils are sown in the nature of man. And I think that's really key, because we've given our government this authority through the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, a lot of different versions. We've given them the authority over our rights, and in different areas. They almost divide them up in different ways. And while a single authoritarian or a king was a big concern of the founding fathers, it was also there was also the concern of factions breaking apart the country. It was a big one. So you're worried about tyranny from a single ruler or a mob rule, but you're also worried about the lack of unity and factions breaking up the country. And from a Catholic perspective, I've said my patron saint, I end with this sign off, that you're the king's good servant, but God's first. It came from St. Thomas More. He was a brilliant lawyer, philosopher, writer in England, and was killed by King Henry VIII, the one with 6 wives. And that led to the Protestant Reformation in England, which is a great reason to do it. But he killed St. Thomas More. And he said, St. Thomas More said at one point, men are so made that they love to be ruled until the ruler turns tyrannical, and then they revolt and the cycle starts again. And this can be us Americans today if we're not careful. From chaos, we crave order. And what he's getting at is that if there's chaos, we crave order, and then we'll give up our rights and to have order. And then that order becomes tyrannical, and then we get sick of it, and then we go back to chaos because people revolt. And then back again. So there's this cycle. So how do we stop the cycle? We do what the founding fathers said, and we live by the natural rights of us and our fellow citizens. We hold our leaders to that. We elect people who are not going to violate our natural rights. James Madison says here in Federalist paper number 10, where men are divided by opinion, they are united by force. And so that's one way a government can be tyrannical and try to do that, is by force. So really bad things can happen when factions descend into chaos, because force is used to try to unite them. So what do we get when we order up a good dose of faction? We get we get some KFC, man, some extra crispy chaos. And I'm just trying to keep that rosary in one of your hands and the Constitution in the other, man. Like I said, rosary in one hand, Constitution in the other. Big church, small government. And, self-government, small government. And it's really important, man. It'll make the world so much better if you just do these two things. Remember, our catechism says society ensures social justice when it provides the conditions that allow associations or individuals to obtain what's their due. So the catechism is saying a just society requires that we set the legal conditions that allow associations or individuals to get what they deserve. You don't have to get a society where the mob just gets to take from the minority economically, etc. That's not justice. That leads to chaos. If we take from the people who work and give to those that don't, it's a recipe for chaos. And factions are everywhere today. And obviously Madison would, if you were here, like, hey, told you so, man, go read Federalist number 10. It's there, man. But I think they'd also say, don't despair. I mean, obviously the Lord himself would say that, and don't quit. And we Catholics have to know our principles. We vote smart, be principled, not let either party violate the rights of us or our neighbors. We got to teach our kids natural law and our faith. This podcast is there for this reason. I want you to know the source and where we came from. because today is not a good example. If you just look at what Donald Trump's saying, frankly, and you look at what the Democratic Party is saying, you're not going to see the full view of what our founding fathers, of how they thought our government should be. And that's not a shot at you if you follow Trump. If you're a Democrat, I'm just saying that none of them are following it well, frankly, or perfectly. Liberty and freedom are available to us. And if we give other factions that are different than us, then they give that back to us, it'll work. And it's just Catholic common sense here. Don't trust the government to run your life and say that they will to make society better by taking your money and giving it to what you think is a good idea. And the other side just continually do. These factions just keep fighting perpetually. And the Republican officials and Democrat officials are made up of the same selfish flesh that we all are made up of. So judgment on them, it's all of us. And sometimes, they act worse than the average person. And there's greed and power involved, and that corrupts the heart of man. And so we have to limit government. We have to stop letting these people make you hate other factions and stop taking each other's freedoms and each other's rights. They are using you to accomplish their goals when you are an apologist for your political party, your political leader, your political idol, when all you do is go around and defend every single thing they do, and without being willing to step up and criticize them when they violate rights, you are not helping. We have to get back to the idea that we have to have principles of limited government, like the founders intended. And we can have these diverse factions again. And we can argue in the cultural sphere about the best way to live. We can spread the gospel as Catholics. We should be. But we shouldn't be forcing that on people or want that. And we shouldn't let them force that on us. We should fight that. And that's the way we can, politically. And that's the way that we can live together and strive together to have a united society. So, Federalist number 10, it's not just boring history. It's a prophetic warning, really, and a roadmap from men who took us out of actual tyranny, and study what tyrants did and how they acted. And I really think it's great because the next podcast, we're going to keep going through to the next really important Federalist number 51. And we're going to talk about checks and balances and how important they are. I get so tired of President Biden and President Trump at the State of the Union giving a lecture to the Supreme Court. Both of them did it. It's just so classless. Frankly, both of those guys have about that much of the intellectual ability of any one of our justices that are on the Supreme Court. And, it's funny to see them lecture them about holding up the rights of man, the separation of powers, the checks and balances. It's just it reeks of a tyrant to have you sit in front of him and let him lecture. And it happened in the Biden administration. It happened in the Trump administration. I'm just sick of it. It's disgusting. It's like he knows both of them knew that they'd have to sit there and take it. And these are justices that you appointed and you talk bad about them. And, it's just not a good look in the executive branch. And we have checks and balances for a reason. I have serious concerns, and I'm not the only one. I have serious concerns about the erosion of the separation of powers from both political parties that has been going on now for decades. And it's really scary because both of you all are eroding our liberties in different ways. And you're so blind to your power seeking that you can't even see it except when the other person does it. And so we got to get back on the idea that we are going to hold firm the rights of us, of our posterity, of our neighbor. If you're a white person, you should be the first person to uphold the liberty of a black person, of a gay person. If you're a gay person, you should be the first person to uphold the religious liberty of someone who disagrees with you. That's how we have a society that functions. I always say, and my dream is that, God forbid us ever getting into World War III. But if we go to World War III, I want a Catholic and a Protestant and a Jew and a Gentile, or a Jew and an Arab nowadays, or a Jew and a Muslim nowadays, a gay and a straight man, whatever, to all be able to fight together for liberty, for freedom, to that one uniting principle that we had as a country, which is, overall, which is these are inalienable rights given to all of us to live out our lives the way that we see fit. And that is unifying. If Oregon stops the attacks in the way that they are, and Texas does in the way that they are, and we let people be free, we can once again live in peace and harmony as the founding fathers intended. So I hope you'll tune in to the next one, Federalist number 51. Remember, you're the king's good servant, but God's first. Remember that. Keep that in mind. That's St. Thomas More right there coming at you. Cheers until next time.